Which leads me into this question of the nursing identity. What is it that nurses are trained to believe about themselves and each other? And this very much ties into the image of the superhero, which is quite often talked about. So on the left here, we have quite an old image, a sort of very 1950s style nurse flying to the rescue. The nurse is on her way. But we had an explosion of these kind of images during the COVID pandemic. And particularly, you see these sort of Marvel cartoons where the nurses are sort of incorporated into this whole universe of superheroes. And we also get a lot of talk about nurses as angels. And none of it is human. The nurse is not a human being. The nurse has to be the superhero who is strong and powerful and will come to other people's rescue. And that is really a very difficult identity to live with, but it's also a very difficult identity to let go of. It's very powerful. And I think I touched earlier on about this sense of watching as a child when a nurse looks after a relative. When you have that first experience of being with a patient and you transform their life, you keep them human. You make it possible for them to be able to carry on within that hospital setting, or to deal with their grief or their illness. It's a really powerful feeling that hooks you back into that work, and you want to have that again. So you want to be the superhero. And it's really good to think, I am powerful, I can cope with anything. And we really cling on to that, I think, at the same time as having an inkling that this is really not good. So that nursing identity is not just about the individual, about how I feel about myself, but it's also about the group. And there's very much a strong sense that as a nurse, you are part of a team of superheroes and you all depend on each other. And anybody who shows any kind of weakness is letting their colleagues down as well. So if you are not a superhero enough to get to the end of your shift and have done all the work, and you go home, you've dumped that, would be the phrase, I suppose, on your colleagues. And that really is not allowable, regardless of whether that workload was a reasonable one. Or if I remember a time where I came out of laying out the body of somebody that I'd been nursing, so a very emotional situation, coming out of that room to be faced by a relative who wanted me to put flowers in a vase and was very agitated that this was the most important thing at the time. And I had to flip instantly into put on the smile, because the superhero nurse has got to be there for that relative and their crisis. As much as for the person who was behind the door behind me, who I'd just been laying out, having just died. And so the superhero has to be able to do this on the flip of a hat, cope with whatever's thrown at them, regardless. And what underpins a lot of this superhero stuff is a real sense of fear of what happens if you fail. And this is an advert, a recruitment poster from World War I to encourage people to come into the Red Cross. And it baffles me as to why this might even remotely attract people. I suppose it's a very romantic image of the beautiful young nurse. But the message there, I think, is still very much one that people recognise. If I fail, he dies. And what I heard again and again in my thesis was nurses who would say, if I don't keep going, if I'm not strong enough, if I'm not the superhero, somebody is going to die. And a mounting fear as their workloads get bigger and it becomes harder and harder to meet their own and other people's expectations. Somebody's going to die. And I used to think that when somebody died, that maybe people would change things and start listening. But I was present on several occasions where patients died because we didn't have the resources, where we failed, and nothing changed, which was incredibly demoralizing. And I actually found that some of the nurses who had made that decision to leave nursing completely, this was at the heart of it, because the way they argued it was, if I get it wrong and somebody dies, it's my registration on the line. I'm going to be blamed. But more importantly, I shouldn't be carrying on in this situation when I know it's dangerous. I'm actually not doing the patients a service. So I am going to leave. I'm going to make a stand and say this is not good enough. But at the heart of that decision was the patient, not the nurse. Even though in the background there was this sense of, really, I shouldn't be expected to do this. It's about what happens to him. Is he going to die because I can't do my job? So how do nurses cope with this situation? And I've talked about this already, this sense of disconnect from the emotions. And this is another cartoon from the same book that I showed earlier. which really shows how nurses do respond, and that as a group, actually, they tend to disappear and to become faceless because there is so little power to actually influence what's going on around them and what they're being asked to do. And for a very long time, there's been huge resistance to the idea of striking, because the bottom line was that would hurt patients. Regardless, we have to just take it all on ourselves because the patient is all that matters. And very interesting, that is something when I asked myself now, doing the more recent survey, what's changed, is that we see images of nurses who are out on the streets with banners and they are striking. That is huge, absolutely huge. But I have to ask, what's behind that? How much of that is, we shouldn't have to take this anymore? And that's very definitely there now in ways it wasn't before. But there's still that line of, we have to defend the patients, and patients are already dying. So we have to do something about this situation. If you found this video helpful, please do click on like below and subscribe to my channel. You might also like to hop across using the links to my Facebook or LinkedIn pages, where you'll find much more content.